Let's talk about what makes a classic a classic. If you're like a lot of readers, you've probably had the experience of reading a classic novel and wondering to yourself, why is this book so great? So today I want to talk about 3 reasons why books become classics. Sometimes our response to them is just a matter of taste, but other times it's because we don't understand the larger context of the novel, and so it helps to think about what makes a novel a classic. One reason that books become classics is that they're doing something that at the time they were written was brand new. The problem is if we're reading them many decades or even centuries later, it's harder for us to see that new thing happening because other writers have come along and done the same thing. So let me give you a couple of examples. One of them would be Mark Twain's classic novel, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, which is still taught in many high schools and even middle schools. It's considered to be, by some people, the greatest American novel ever written, but by others, certainly a classic American novel. The problem is that it's really hard to see that today because what we don't realize is that Mark Twain was one of the first writers to play around with dialect in the way he did. He's writing very much in the voice of his character, Huck Finn, who's a boy, whose diction is not elevated as we might expect literary diction to be, but who talks like a boy. He tells the story in first person, and so Twain is really playing around with his voice in a way that a lot of writers had not done before. That was one of the things that made this novel stand out, and one of the reasons why it became part of the canon. Another example would be Virginia Woolf's novel, Mrs. Dalloway. Mrs. Dalloway is one of the first novels written in English that is playing with multiple points of view. So more traditionally, a novel would be told from a single point of view, but Woolf tells that story of one single day on which her title character is planning a party from the viewpoints of multiple characters. So we're inside the heads of several different characters, including Mrs. Dalloway, and there Woolf is doing something that at the time was quite original, but today is a fairly stock literary device that a lot of writers have used. A second reason why books become classics is because they're beloved in their own time and then get passed on to the next generation of readers. They become sentimental to us. We value them partly because they connect us back to our parents or grandparents who also loved those books, sometimes connecting us back several generations to the original readers who loved those books the best. There are lots of examples of these kinds of books, but one of them is Louisa May Alcott's novel, Little Women. Little Women probably couldn't even be published today, although it does have a really great, strong female protagonist. In other ways, it's a very old-fashioned, sweet and sentimental story that even at the time, Alcott wrote not because she felt it was going to be a great novel, but because she needed money. So that novel gets passed on from generation to generation and continues to be loved and considered a classic for that reason. Another great example would be the poem Paul Revere's Ride by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Again, not considered to be great poetry and not even great history. Longfellow has built up a legend around Paul Revere's Ride, but it's very easy to recite and it gets passed on again and again and again so that it still gets taught in classrooms today because we love it for sentimental reasons. The third kind of classic novel is one that deals with universal themes that continue to resonate with readers today. These tend to be psychological novels because human nature never changes. So one example of this would be Flaubert's Madame Bovary. At the time it was published, it was considered quite scandalous, but even today it gives us a psychological portrait of a character that we might in our own time still recognize, a woman who's bored by her marriage and undertakes an absolutely disastrous love affair. Another classic that falls into this category would be Melville's novel Moby Dick. Again, a novel that's read over and over and over again that probes the psychological depths of Captain Ahab, who is out for revenge a topic that continues to be relevant to us in any day and time. You might notice that only one of these three types of classics actually has the power to impress us as brand new readers coming to them today, and that's that third kind, the one with universal themes. So the first type of classic novel that's based on something new, of course, doesn't feel new anymore. So those of us who are more experienced readers might be better at ferreting out that newness and recognizing it and being impressed by it in a historical sort of way. And then there are those second type of books that are sentimental, and maybe we'll appreciate those if that sentiment was passed down to us. But of course, a lot of us didn't receive that sentimental value from somebody in our family or a friend who passed it on to us. And so those novels actually are probably the most likely to fall out of the canon. One example of these sentimental classics that may actually be falling out of the canon now is Laura Ingalls Wilder's Little House books. They're absolutely beloved by generations of little girls in particular, but they're not being passed on from my generation to the next now because we're starting to read them through a more exacting historical lens that notices the fact that Laura Ingalls Wilder's father was actually an illegal settler on Native American land in the West. So that changes our perspective of her story and makes it less likely to be passed on as a classic to the next generation. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is the quality of writing in the classics. So with the exception of some of the more sentimental classics, those that were doing something new in their time and those that were exploring universal themes are also beautifully written books, often risk-taking books, but all excellent examples of what great writing has been and can be. So that's one reason, maybe the reason above all, to pick up one of these classic novels once in a while and enjoy them as beautifully written examples of literature. The classics have survived for a reason. So the next time you pick up a classic novel, either on your own or with your book club, give some thought to why it's a classic. What has made it survive as part of our Western canon of literature? That question may bring you to some interesting depth and realizations about what you're reading that you might have missed otherwise. Read on.